to let go. Of course, I'm happy to help with that process. Finish them.
In January of 2022, Sony Pictures had planned to release the Marvel movie Morbius, the Living Vampire. This is based on a comic book character that is a Spider-Man villain and yes, a vampire. Now this got pushed back to April of 2022, but the Asylum were all ready to go with their Mockbuster ready and waiting, this one being Dracula, the original living vampire, and thus it was released anyway. Now Dracula is a property that exists in the public domain, meaning anyone can make a Dracula movie, and that's why we have so many of them. Now this is an Asylum picture, albeit it plays a little bit more like a kind of a British drama in a lot of ways. There has been a number of movies directed by Steve Lawson that this movie feels like it's very much in the kind of the same vein of, if you'll excuse the pun. Now this one is directed by a guy whose name I'm going to struggle to pronounce here, Maximilian Elfett, and stars Jake Herbert as Dracula. And it's a low budget affair and is somewhat of a reimagining of the Dracula legend. We have characters and locations that are kind of in the original novel, but a lot of it is being changed. For example, we have Van Helsing, who is now a woman and who is in a relationship with Mina. So there you go, lots of kind of changes afoot. And the actual time, because of the era that this movie is taking place in, I'm not entirely sure when it's meant to be. It's clearly meant to be in the past at some point, but it's kind of unclear when exactly it's meant to be taking place because they seem to be, you know, quite scientific in their approach. We have some degree of technology and kind of modern kind of speech, but it still has a somewhat of an old style aesthetic, and we see horse-drawn carriages and things. So it's quite unclear when this movie is supposed to be taking place. I would probably imagine maybe at the kind of the turn of the century, you know, early kind of 1900s or something like that. So the story, as I say, is somewhat of a reimagining, and it kind of plays more like a Jack the Ripper story in some respects. Van Helsing, as I say, is a detective here, and she's investigating a slew of murders where the victims have been drained of blood. Renfield is her kind of police captain. Harker is kind of like a scientist that is kind of helping them. And we have Michael Ironside here, who is as the kind of the named talent, who is a kind of a coroner. Albeit he's not on the screen a hell of a lot. And of course we know that the perpetrator is going to be Dracula. What'll happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss what I think works in this movie. Now, as I've said, this is an Asylum film, and they are known for knocking out quick kind of mockbusters to coincide with larger mainstream films. Though this one, I will say, it does feel a little different. It certainly is a slower paced film. It's a lot more kind of character driven than some of the kind of the other Asylum films. I do feel they do a better job in kind of establishing characters in this movie than maybe a lot of kind of Asylum films. And as I say, it does feel more like the kind of like the Steve Lawson directed slew of kind of, you know, British kind of horror thrillers, and or if you're unfamiliar with that, maybe kind of like older kind of like BBC productions and things. So it has a little bit more of a kind of a talky feel to it, but it benefits from having more kind of like drawn characters in some respects. I have to say as well, I actually didn't think some of the acting was so bad here for a lower budget movie. The guy who plays Harker, I actually didn't think a bad job, and the lady who plays Van Helsing, there are some scenes where I feel she does a good job, albeit I feel some of the kind of sequences were not so good either. And Michael Ironside, I have to say, is pretty good in the small role he has as the kind of the coroner. There is some reasonable kind of like makeup effects towards the end of the movie with kind of some prosthetics and things like that. There's some nice looking kind of B-roll, kind of establishing shots of various kind of castles and, you know, old-fashioned kind of streets and things like that. And I actually quite like some of the kind of the intelligent conversation that we have in regards to our characters discussing the possibilities about maybe what's going on. and kind of, you know, disproving or proving certain theories and things like that. It almost takes a kind of a old-fashioned kind of police procedural style kind of drama rather than kind of an out-and-out horror at times. So those of you who like, you know, period stuff, albeit still on a B-movie level, may enjoy this movie. And, you know, it feels maybe it's just had a little bit more time taken over this film than a lot of Asylum movies, which obviously have a very kind of quick turnaround. I suspect this was never meant to be a, you know, a Morbius mockbuster. It's just the subtitle that this movie had, and it's just kind of been put out and probably, I would say, maybe purchased by the Asylum. That's only speculation. Yeah, and so, you know, I've got to say, it was still a relatively kind of interesting movie if you are kind of, you know, happy to watch a lower budget B movie. But what doesn't work here? Okay, I have to say, as much as I could have appreciated the attempt here to have a little bit more fleshed out characters, a little bit more kind of scientific approach to certain subjects and a maybe more intelligent approach. Maybe intelligent is the right, not the right word here. More intelligent than a lot of Asylum movies is maybe a better phrase to use. It still has some incredibly cheesy and dumb dialogue. The dialogue here, I feel, is butchered in certain places. Poorly written and doesn't suit the kind of the era that this movie is apparently supposed to take place in. It feels cheesy, and in some scenes, it's very, very poorly delivered by the actors. The guy that they got to play Dracula, to me, is miscast. I've got the feeling they probably employed him because he kind of looks a little bit like emo. But he looks way too young. He's way too tanned. And he doesn't have a hell of a lot of charisma, to be honest with you. Now, Dracula is on screen less than you may expect in this movie. But I have to say, when he is on screen, he doesn't really have much in the way of screen presence. And I think that was maybe the worst casting decision. I can understand how he looks kind of like a little bit like a, you know, long-haired kind of, you know, goth kid or whatever. But yeah, he just looks kind of too young to me. It doesn't have any gravitas, if you know what I mean. Dracula to me should be a character when he enters the room. He's kind of like, everyone kind of like, you know, pays attention and kind of the air gets kind of sucked out of the room, metaphorically speaking. But there's no way the case here. He just looks like a kind of like a teenager coming in, to be honest with you, and doesn't really have the presence, even when he's kind of delivering his kind of lines and stuff like that. But it's not just him. There are other characters as well where I feel the kind of the line delivery is a little bit kind of you know, dry at times, and a little bit kind of you know, the dialogue itself isn't particularly good through the movie. It's a little bit too talky, if I'm honest. We don't really get a lot of kind of horror elements to it. There's a reasonable amount of nudity in this movie, but I feel it's very light on the kind of the horror elements. It tries to have a little bit of humour here and there, but I feel it doesn't go far enough to really have this, like, call it a comedy. So it sticks out as being somewhat out of place at times. It could have either lent into that more or really not had it. It just feels oddly out of place. And they could have way dialed up the door here. If you're going to have lots of boobs in it, you may as well have some gore in there as well, and just kind of like, you know, make it for those gore hounds. Unfortunately, the bulk of the actual vampiric action, so to speak, is just saved to the last act. You know, it makes the first two acts a little bit dull and a little bit dry, considering it's obviously a low budget film and we're kind of dealing with maybe probably inexperienced actors. So I feel in some instances do a good job, but less so in others. And the conversation is rather dry at times, it must be said. I don't think this is a terrible movie, to be honest with you, and I have to say it's probably better than a lot of the Asylum films I have watched, but I do not think it's even an above average film, but it's maybe just a tad below average for me, but not unwatchable. I still think it had a certain amount of watchability to it, you know, and I kind of didn't mind some of the kind of the changes. I felt it needed to have a little bit more confidence behind the camera and maybe had a little bit more going on the screen, and obviously again the Dracula character needed to be rethought I'll give this one a 4 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.